The academic project that I'm working on at the moment as a follow-up to the State of Nature book is about ideas of the common and the common good. And as part of thinking about those ideas, I wanted to come here to the cloisters of the Met Museum to look at one very particular set of tapestries. They depict a unicorn hunt. And I want to use this set of tapestries as a way to think about ideas of the common and enclosure and the commons in Western history and in the contemporary world. Now, I wasn't able to film inside the cloisters, but I was able to record a little bit of audio. And in this video, I want to use these tapestries as a jumping off point to meditate on ideas of the common and the commons today. I want to think a little now about what might be the first tapestry in the series, which depicts a group of hunters with their dogs setting off on a hunt, being beckoned forward by what looks like a little boy in the top right. And what really strikes you as you stand in front of this is the great hesitancy shown by the hunters and by their dogs. They do not look motivated for this hunt. Some of the dogs are looking back. One of the dogs has its head down sheepishly, as if it's ashamed of what it's about to do. Nobody is thrusting themselves forward into the scene. And as I stand in front of it, what that says to me is that it speaks of a conflict in the desire to possess and control and enclose. That this is something perhaps that these hunters, that these dogs feel they must do, but it's not something that they begin relishing. They will relish it later. By the end of the hunt, some of them will be zealously stabbing their spears into the unicorn. The appetite has come with the hunt, but at the beginning there's no deep conviction that this is something that must be done. And I'm no doubt reading too much into it when I see in that a parable of modern life. Here we are, doing our thing, going out on our hunts, our journeys, doing what we have to do, with no resounding conviction that this is the thing that must be done. And there's another uncannily static moment in the tapestry where the unicorn is letting the water run over its horn and healing the water, and the hunters are standing around unable to attack it while it's performing its miracle as the story's required, and unsure what to do with themselves. Some are pointing at the unicorn, some are chatting to each other, some have their hands on hips, their spears have been shouldered, and it's a moment of rest in the midst of pursuit and violence. And as I'm standing before that particular tapestry now, looking at it, I do feel that I'm mirroring these people, taking a moment out of a busy day, taking a moment out of hustling or whatever else the different people who are walking through here today will be doing, to contemplate the depiction of a miracle in front of me before I walk on and continue the pursuit of my life. One feature of the commons that these tapestries help us see really clearly, I think, is that it's always irreducibly both physical and ideological. If you take the example of common space in medieval times, the commons where people would gather firewood and so forth, there's a physical space, there's material, there's the firewood. But there's also a set of customs and expectations, a set of ideas about how that space is used. And so far in my research on the commons, there's at least these two aspects. Sometimes it's much more complicated than that, but there's at least both the physical or the domain, even if it's a virtual sort of online domain, and the ideas and structures that govern it. And in these tapestries, we see beautifully coming together two interwoven ways of thinking about the commons. The first is really material, that it is very clear that it took a lot of people a lot of time working together, bringing different skills together in order to produce these tapestries. There's the dyers, the weavers, the designers. There's a common pooling of physical skill that's needed. But there's also, on the level of ideas and symbolic commons, that the shared narratives of the idea of the unicorn as this pure animal that is able to heal things with its horn, and then the weaving into this as well of motifs of death and rebirth from the Gospels, this symbolic commons, this shared narrative idea. And what the tapestries do beautifully, very delicately, is they bring these two commons together, the material commons of producing the physical tapestry and the symbolic commons, the narrative commons of what's being depicted in the tapestry. There's a very poignant tapestry where the unicorn has been struck and it's bleeding from its hind, and it's been chased by any number of dogs, each with an elaborate, heavy-looking collar on, and by any number of hunters with rather unwieldy, large spears. And the only uncollared, unencumbered animal in the scene is the unicorn itself, that which has not been appropriated, that which hasn't been branded, given an insignia, being chased down by all these identifiable, branded individuals with their identifiable, branded animals, as if it's impossible to allow the commons, the free, to continue existing without being brought to heel. And in that panel, there's a circular shape made by all the different spears pointing at the unicorn in a way that physically suggests the idea of enclosure, of delimiting, of making static so that something can be commoditized, so that it can be made into a thing captured and caught. And so the commons is both the abject, that which is not owned, that which is outside the circulation of possessions, but also, for that same reason, the sacred, that which is set apart, different from the run of daily life. In other words, it is in both senses of the term priceless. Another feature of the commons that's brought out beautifully, I think, in these tapestries is the idea that the commons never exists in a vacuum by itself. It always exists in relationship to the public and the private. And it's the way that those relationships are negotiated, the way in which things are made common, or the way in which things are taken out of the common and made public or private, that is key to understanding the common, I think. And we can see this again, just to take the example of medieval common land. Its value is only when firewood or grazing or something like that is taken out of the common and appropriated. When a particular person takes particular sticks of firewood and uses them on their own fire, appropriates them, takes them away so that other people can't use them. Now, that's what it's there for. Nothing's going wrong, but it's that relationship between the common and the private that's the heart of understanding what the commons is. And this set of complex relationships between the public, the common and the private is really on show, I think, in these tapestries. They would have been produced, we think, in the context of various guilds that would have governed the way in which the artisans function, that would have set prices for their work and so forth. They were commissioned, I read somewhere, by Anne of Brittany, so by a private wealth. They wouldn't exist without the condition of possibility of the private sphere funding them. They were financed by private patrons. They were donated to the Met Museum by John D. Rockefeller Jr. Again, private wealth, creating a space in which this commons, this symbolic commons of the unicorn and the motifs can be explored. The tapestry where the unicorn is bucking and ripping a dog's flesh with its horn is powerful testimony to the way in which the symbolic commons isn't just an object that can be manipulated at will and with impunity, nor the physical commons. So much writing recently on the ecological commons has been pushing back against this idea of externalities, that damage to the ecosystem can simply be put off balance sheet. And symbolically as well, I think. We can't manipulate the stories that have been passed down through generation to generation with absolute impunity, retelling them in just any way we want. There is, quite literally, in this tapestry I'm stood in front of at the moment, there is quite literally a kickback. There are consequences to enclosing, to manipulating, to doing with the symbolic commons just whatever we want. There's also the mythical nature of the unicorn as the one unbranded, uncontrolled, untamed animal in these tapestries. It has an ethereal nature. It doesn't exist in the same demarcated way as everything else does. And to the extent that we can read this as an image of the symbolic commons, then it can't be appropriated, it can't be enclosed and delimited. It always exists out of our grasp, out of our reach. It's never safe, it's never controlled or owned in the same way that the dogs and the horses and the spears and the fine clothes can be. And the fact that these tapestries are being exhibited in the Met Museum adds another layer of complexity to their relationship to the commons. Because one of the ways of understanding what museums do is that they are custodians of the commons. They might be publicly owned, they might be privately owned, but what they are often seeking to pass on and conserve and understand and disseminate are either common artifacts, cultural commons, symbolic commons, common memories. And the way in which these tapestries that were created probably in Brussels are being exhibited in New York is seeking to share this commons in an international way. There are limits, there are blind spots to that, of course, but it is nevertheless a sharing. And there's also a generational commons involved. There's a sense in the museum deciding to exhibit these things for us to see, that there is something important that was cultivated and explored by previous generations that we should be able to have access to and to share. And so there's this temporal sharing across the generations, there's this geographical sharing, all of which is to do with cultivating and understanding and disseminating symbolic and artifact-based commons. And if we are reading this series of tapestries as a parable of enclosure, then the two fragments above the door are incredibly poignant. that the unicorn is finally tamed and brought to heel, not through violence, but through, as the myth has it, a virgin's tender touch, that it is wooed into submission, rather than bludgeoned into submission. In the same way, perhaps, that the promise of enclosing the commons is often much greater than the rewards or the benefits that it brings for those who enjoyed its benefits previously. The whole series of panels could be read as a parable of enclosure, and if it is read in that way, then that final panel where the unicorn is draped lifeless across the horse is a terrible anagnoresis, a terrible realization that what the hunt has been aiming at all along, the capturing, the taming, the commodifying of this ethereal, mythical, symbolic commons of an animal, that it's an empty enclosure. But perhaps also the realization in that they haven't achieved what they thought because they haven't enclosed or delimited the unicorn at all. They may have its carcass, but the symbolic commons, the stories into which this unicorn is woven, continue to be told. They haven't captured anything. It remains commons. And therefore that final panel, where the unicorn, perhaps in some sort of heavenly dwelling, is shackled though happy, looking upwards, is the true resting place of the story. Not in the capturing and branding of the symbolic commons, but it's continually making itself available willingly to be reworked, but never dominated, never enclosed. And therefore this tapestry that I keep coming back to, where the unicorn is on the back of the horse, there's a huge crushing irony about it. And it's a abyssal disappointment, but also there's a wonderful thrill to it too. But the people in the tapestry don't seem to understand the thrill. The abyssal disappointment, of course, is at the end of all their striving and hunting. They still haven't found what they're looking for. There it is, the carcass of the unicorn on the back of the horse. There should be a moment of triumph. No one's smiling. No one's laughing. It isn't there. But the delicious truth behind that, the truth that they haven't yet realized, and perhaps tragically never will, is that uncapturability, that inability to be delimited of the symbolic commons, is what makes it what it is. It's what makes it a freeing, creative, uncontrollable force. And if it could be controlled, all the worse for all of us. And perhaps the moment of brilliance is that the cadaver of the unicorn returns as the series of tapestries, as the retelling of this trope of the healing unicorn, passing it on, paying it forward, one more generation, one more iteration, in a way that hasn't dominated or limited the symbolic commons that it's engaged with, but actually enriched it. And therefore this final tapestry of the unicorn gazing up the length of its horn is the vindication of the symbolic commons that can't be appropriated,